Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Yes? Okay. All right. So I don't know if some of you attended the A2 workshop yesterday. It was a long workshop, pretty dense, pretty tough content. Tonight is something that is usually not very challenging for the students. We need to have a look at the last topic of the first chapter, which is money. So we'll be talking about the difference between the barter and a money economy. And we will also be talking about the different characteristics of money, the functions of money, the different types, and we'll also look at the difference between narrow and broad money. That's essentially everything that your students need to know in the AS syllabus. And then once we are done with this will be the end of the first chapter already. You see that in only what is it today? Today is the third workshop, AS workshop that we have. So we have basically 6 hours in total. And in 6 hours, we managed to cover the entire first chapter. So of course, with your students, it's okay to spend more time, and you should spend way more time than that. Then once we are done with money, we will be able to move on and start the second chapter, which is entitled The Price System and the Microeconomy. And the two first topics that we will discuss together are simply supply and demand. Starting with demand. Why do I start by demand? Simply because it's usually more intuitive for students, because we are all consumers. And because of that, that makes the concept of demand more intuitive, more straightforward to understand. But you will see that the two PPTs, the one for demand and the one for supply, they are almost the same. At least they are organized the same. Of course, the determinants of supply are not the determinants of demand, but that's they are very similar. So spend enough time on demand, and if your students have clearly understood how demand works, everything they need to know about it, then supply should really be very simple. Then the only thing that you have to do left is to talk about the determinants of supply, and that's it. And next week, we will talk about elasticities. Okay, as always, there are plenty of documents. These are all the documents that you can download from the website. I have not yet created the archive. So if you want to download everything all together, I will create the archive later today or maybe tomorrow. Yeah, if you don't want to click 33 times on each file, please wait until the archive is available. But as always, you have the teacher's PPT, the student's PPT, the concept cards, the definition, the essay questions. And okay, so that should definitely be enough to support the organization of your lessons. Okay, let's get started. Let's start with money. So usually it's very common to start with, all right, what if we did not have money? we use money every day, but what if we didn't have money? So that's this is when you talk about what we call a barter economy, which is sometimes we call that a non-cash economy, but essentially an economy in which we do not have money, and therefore this does not mean that we can't trade, but the only way we can trade is by directly swapping one good for the other. That's the concept of a barter economy, and it actually still exists, and we sometimes do that. So that's at the scale of the entire economy, but sometimes it happens. This could be mostly in terms of services. You don't really swap one good with another, but you can swap one service with another. You provide a service for someone, and in return, this person will provide another service. This is a form of barter. So it's, even though the existence of money has all made barter not very common, it still exists. Okay, but there are, of course, many big problems in a barter economy. And the main one, if there is one problem that the students need to remember, it's what we call the double coincidence of wants. That's really the main issue. Why is this a big deal? Because it's going to discourage trade. It's going to make trade very complicated, because in that case, if you want a transaction to take place, you need two conditions. You need to have someone, to have something that another person wants, and that other person must have something that you want. So that's pretty complicated, right? To find someone with whom to trade in a barter economy, because you have these two very restrictive conditions. And why is this a limitation? Because, well, we haven't really studied the gains from trade at that stage of the year, but you can simply explain to your students that, well, trade is something that is beneficial to the economy, that improves the standards of living, especially because it allows people to specialize, to focus on things they are good at. If we cannot trade, or if it's very difficult to trade, then we can't really afford to specialize, because we might not be able to purchase what we want. So that's why a barter economy, it's not working really well, and that's why it's not conducive to economic development. Essentially, there are, of course, a few other problems, but again, the main one really is the double coincidence of wants. Another problem might be, well, if you use animals, like live animals, to trade, well, it's difficult to divide animals. Okay, how do you trade, or how do you if you want to trade one I don't know, half a cow in exchange for something else? Was complicated to divide some things, and we'll see that divisibility is a desirable characteristic for money. There might be some storage issue. Yeah, things might be very, like, what you use, what you want to trade might be extremely large, heavy, complicated to carry around. It might be perishable, and that's why we'll see that two desirable characteristics of money are portability and durability. Yeah. And, well, because essentially we don't have any unit of account here, that's one desirable function of money, it might be complicated to establish an exchange rate. So here I'm not talking about the exchange rate between currencies, I'm talking about the exchange rate between different goods, right? Very complicated to say, all right, so I have a cow, you have bananas, so how do we trade? How do we determine the relative value of one cow in terms of bananas? That's pretty complicated if we do not have money. So yeah, essentially, remember that this is a system that doesn't work very well. It makes trade costly and difficult, and therefore it discourages trade and it prevents specialization. And this is something that is an obstacle to economic development. So then, why don't you use money? Instead, why don't we engage in a form, something that we call a money economy? So, but first, what is money? So it's a bit complicated to, if you look at very different textbooks, you will have very different definitions, and I chose to keep it simple because I did not want to talk about the functions of money that early. So I just said money is an asset. So an asset is essentially something valuable, okay, that can be used to buy goods and services. So you see that my definition mostly refers to the medium of exchange function of money, but I don't want to mention it at that stage. So it's okay to just, for now, keep a simple definition. Something valuable that you can use to buy goods and services. Simple definition. Yes. And here, what we should emphasize, and when we compare a barter economy with a money economy, we have to understand that the main advantage of money, what really makes it valuable, is that it eliminates the need for a double coincidence of wants. Now it's no longer necessary to find someone who wants what you have and to make sure that this person has something that you want. What you can do instead, and this is the example that I give here, if you have money, so you have something, you sell it, so you exchange it for money, and that's pretty easy. The only thing that you need to find is to find someone who wants what you have, but it could be anyone. And then you use this money, the money you've received, to buy anything that you want from anyone. So you see that the introduction of money gives you way more freedom to trade. It dramatically increases your the likelihood that you can trade, because you instead of having to instead of trade being bilateral, where you have like only this trade between two persons, you can actually trade with anyone in the economy, and therefore this is something that will greatly encourage trade. You have an example here. Well, I'm not going to detail it. It's pretty straightforward. And again, why is this good? Why is this good that money will stimulate trade? Because again, we talked about that in earlier. This was actually last week when we talked about specialization and the division of labor. And I explained that specialization cannot take place unless we can trade. We specialize in the production of something, and we must be able to be confident that we will be able to trade what we have for what we don't have. Otherwise, we would never give up self-sufficiency. So money will stimulate trade, and it will therefore enable specialization. And specialization, we'll see that later when studying absolute and comparative advantage, but specialization, when individuals, firms, or countries focus on producing what they are best at, is something that definitely improves the living standards. So that's why money is actually valuable. We said that money is not a resource most of the time, unless you want to provide a financial loan or something like that, right, Mitchell? But money is valuable not because it can produce something, but because it can stimulate trade. Okay, so that's really why money has a value in the economy. Okay, and that's pretty much the introduction of money. I think it's important to start there, comparing the barter economy with the money economy, and to understand why money is actually extremely powerful and extremely valuable in an economy, not as a resource, but as something that enables trade. Then we can talk about the 4 functions of money. So in some books, they only consider 3. But for Cambridge, they usually go through the 4 functions of money, even though the last one, which is a standard for deferred payment, is not really something different from what we have from the 3 first functions. It's more like a consequence. Okay, it's more like a consequence of the 3 first functions of money, but for Cambridge, let's just introduce them as the 4 functions of money. And something that I should say is that students are very often confused, and they very often mix the functions of money with the characteristics of money. So just to make sure that they don't make that mistake, you can just tell them, and that's what I like to say, the 4 functions of money, this essentially means 4 things you can do with money. Right? A function is something you can do. And the 6 characteristics, because there are 6 main characteristics of money, these are essentially 6 things that, how can I phrase it? Or the 6 features of good money. Okay, we sometimes talk about what is a good tax, and we can say the same thing for money. What is good money? So the 6 features, the 6 properties that makes an asset a good form of money. Okay, so it's not about what you can do with it, it's how the asset actually is, the properties of the asset. So what are these functions? So a medium of exchange, we sometimes call it a means of payment. It's the same thing. A store of value. I actually like store of wealth better. I think wealth is more explicit than value. A unit of account, and again, I like a measure of value better. I think it's more clear. It's something we can use money to measure the relative value of things. And the last one, which is again more like a consequence of the three first function, a standard for deferred payment. Okay, so what we are going to do now is to have a look at each of them and just to explain what they mean. But again, really what does it mean for money to be a medium of exchange, a store of value, and so on. So what does it mean for money to be a medium of exchange? So first we should explain what is a medium of exchange? What is a means of payment? Well, this one is pretty easy. It's anything you can use to trade goods and services. That's it, okay? So if you can use an asset to buy a good or a service, instead of using it for your own consumption, then that's actually a medium of exchange. So if you think about, I don't know, something like gold in the past, we used gold as a medium of exchange, not really anymore. But clearly, if you used gold to trade goods and services, so not for consumption, you did not use gold to make jewelry, for example, then we would say that gold is a medium of exchange, okay? So what does it mean when we say money is a medium of exchange? Well, let's just keep it simple, clear cut. That just means that you can use money to buy goods and services. That's it, okay? Remember what we call the functions of money. These are 4 things you can do with money. Okay, that's one. You can buy goods and services with money. That's the medium of exchange or means of payment function of money. Simple. The store of value. So first, again, let's try to understand what is a store of value in general, because money, yes, is or can be a good store of value, but there are other stores of value. So what does it mean? Well, a store of value is just an asset that will keep its purchasing power over time. Okay, so purchasing power here, it's the real value. So essentially, if you have an asset today and it can buy, let's say, 2 tomatoes, and if you have, the same asset in 10 years can still buy at least 2 tomatoes, then clearly this asset is a good store of value because it has preserved, it has held its purchasing power over time. And then it's a good time to stop a little bit and to just ask your students to give examples of things that keep their purchasing power over time. You can ask them, all right, if you wanna invest, you try to avoid invest because it could be confusing. If you want to save, you have some money, but you want to save it, and you want to buy something that will keep its value, that will store your the amount you have today, so you can use it in the future. What would you buy? So of course, the typical example would be gold, could be a collectibles, could be sometimes artwork, could be land, could be real estate, but yeah, classic cars. Just try to encourage them to give other examples, and for each example, try to discuss whether this would be a good store of value. Of course, there is always an element of risk. Okay, we never really know if something is really going to hold its value over time, but then you can say, all right, and perhaps in the past, what did people buy that was, or what types of assets in the past proved to be very good store of value. All right. So for example, in China, well, real estate was definitely a good store of value over the last 20 years. So what does it mean when we say money is a store of value, or one function of money is a store of value? That means that you can use money to save, store, and retrieve wealth in order for you, or for people, to undertake future transactions. Okay, so you save, you don't use the money today. You use it to buy an asset. So an asset is not something you consume, something that you have, okay, you own. And then you're gonna sell this asset in the future to retrieve your money. And well, if this asset was a good store of value, then the money that you get back in the future should have at least the same purchasing power as the beginning. Okay, so for example, if you buy today an apartment for 1 million RMB, and assuming no inflation, okay, you buy, and if in 10 years the apartment is 1.2 million RMB, if you sell it for this amount, well, in that case, you can say that this asset, this apartment, was indeed a good store of value. Again, assuming no inflation. That's it. That's the idea of a store of value. And I have talked about inflation. Why? Because you know that, of course, inflation damages this function. If inflation is high, so of course, if it's sufficiently high, then that means that well, there will be many assets that will, financial assets that will lose value, real value, over time because of inflation. If you have money on a current account, for example, that does not pay any interest, and if the rate of inflation is 2% per year, then what it means is every year you lose 2% of purchasing power. So that's not huge, but that's significant. So that's not, in that case, your let's say your demand deposits are not a perfect store of value, because inflation erodes the value, the real value, the purchasing power of your demand deposits. Okay, then the unit of account. Here the idea is that there are so many different goods and services, thousands, maybe millions of goods and services around. So, and it's, what's the job of consumers? It's consumers and firms. What is what do economic agents have to do? They have to make economic decisions. They have to choose what to buy, what to produce, in what quantities, and so on. So of course, they have to be able to compare the relative value of things. Okay, could be the relative cost, could be the relative price you would receive for something. And because there are so many different goods and services, we need to have a common unit in which we can express the value of everything. And then once we have converted, or once we have expressed the value of all possible goods and services into one common unit, well, that makes things so much easier, right? And then why is this something important? Because it makes economic transactions more efficient, because we have more information. It's easier to make economic decisions because we can better compare the relative value of things. We can make better economic calculations. And that's essentially what we call the unit of account function of money. Money allows people, or allows an economy, to express the value of all things into one single unit, and that makes economic calculations much easier. I usually use a very stupid example with my students. I ask them, what is 1 kilogram plus 500 grams? 1 kilogram plus 500 grams. So usually the answer that they give is 1.5 kilogram. And what they've done, without even realizing it, is that they have converted 500 grams into 0.5 kilogram. Because in order for you to make an economic calculation, or if you want to add two things, it's important that they have the same units. Otherwise, you cannot make the calculation. So first, what the students did is that they made the conversion, they expressed everything in the same unit, and then they were able to make the calculation. And that's the same idea with money. It allows to express the value of all things into one single unit, and therefore it allows calculations, essentially. What did I write? All right, so a unit of account is a measure used by individuals to set prices and make economic calculations, all right? Because you know a muffin costs $5 and a coffee costs $2.5, then you know that the value of one muffin is equal to the value of 2 coffees. Imagine if we didn't have money, how would you compare, right? And that might, if we didn't have money, if we did not have a common unit to compare the value of things, we might not be able to make the best possible economic decisions. Yes, that's what we call the unit of account function of money. And the last one, which is again not super important, if I could choose to drop it, I would actually drop it. A standard for deferred payment. And actually, if you have already taught AP economics, if I remember well, in AP economics, they don't look at this function of money because it's just a consequence. So first, what is a deferred payment? Maybe we can focus on this first. Well, a deferred payment is simply a debt. Yeah. So you buy something today and you pay tomorrow. So you postpone the payment. That's the idea of a deferred payment. Or it could be that you buy something very expensive and you pay in 10 times, for example. Or even if you buy a house, of course, it's likely that you're not going to pay the house up front. So you're going to have the house and you will pay over, I don't know, 10, 15 years. That's a deferred payment. And a standard is just essentially what we are using to settle a debt. What are we going to use to pay back the debt? And when we say that money is a standard for deferred payment, that simply means you can use money to pay back a debt. You can use money to settle a debt. That's it. Okay. Money enables credit, essentially. You can buy something today and use money in the future to pay for the product that you've purchased, for all of it or for part of it, if the payment is divided into several amounts that you pay on a regular basis. That's it. Okay, a deferred payment is a payment postponed until a future date. The standard for deferred payment is what it is denominated in. Okay. Yeah, the unit in which we have to pay back the debt, for example. And okay, so therefore, when we say that money is a standard for deferred payment, it simply means that it enables people to settle debt. So you see, indeed, these four things, these four functions of money, they are four things you can do with money. We can use money to buy goods and services. We can use money to retrieve purchasing power in the future, essentially. We can use money to compare the value of goods and services, and we can use money to settle a debt. So when your students see functions, they should really think about what you can do with it. And then there are the characteristics. So the characteristics is not about what you can do with it. It's about what makes an asset a good form of money. Okay. And there are, again, it varies from one book to the other, but usually we identify 6 main characteristics, 6 features, properties that makes an asset a good form of money. The first one is acceptable, which simply means that we need to make sure that this asset is accepted as money. All right. You must be sure that there will be sellers willing to accept this asset as a form of payment. Okay. And of course, you can connect it to the function, which is the medium of exchange. In order for money to be a medium of exchange and to be able to fulfill this function, it must be acceptable. Okay. If you only have one or two sellers accepting a certain asset as a form of payment, it is not considered acceptable. And a typical example of some form of an asset that is not widely acceptable as a form of money is the Bitcoin, for example. So a Bitcoin is a financial asset, definitely, but it is not widely accepted as a medium of exchange, as a form of payment. There are a few places where you can actually use cryptocurrencies, mostly Bitcoin, but not only as a means of payment. But because it is not widely accepted, we should not regard Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies as a form of money because of that. Because again, remember, one of the functions that defines what money is a medium of exchange, and it requires acceptability. So who knows, perhaps in a few years, the acceptability of cryptocurrencies as a medium of exchange will improve, but for now, it is relatively weak. Then money should be portable. It is not a good idea to use an elephant as a means of payment. That's not going to work very well because, of course, usually when you want to buy something, especially in the past, now things have changed. But in the past, people had to actually go somewhere to trade, to go to a market. Now you can buy everything on Taobao, but in the past, it was very important for you to be able to carry money with you. Okay, so you need to have something that is sufficiently small, sufficiently light for you to be able to take money with you when you go to the market, generally speaking, where you go to a place where you can trade goods and services. Money should be durable. It's important that you have something that is going to withstand physical wear and tear. Otherwise, if money is not durable, then it could not be a good store of value. Of course not. Yes. And you can actually, it's from that perspective, a coin is more durable than a banknote. Yeah. A banknote can burn, it can be damaged by water, even though it is quite resistant, but still it usually deteriorates over time, like the physical banknote. However, coins, they tend to be more durable. Here again, it's mostly to make sure that money is going to be a good store of value. Let's try to find an example of something that would not be durable. Well, just fruits. Okay, why can't we use apples as a medium of exchange? Simply because after some time, well, it will not be edible anymore, and it will deteriorate. Well, it's perishable, and therefore it's not a good store of value. It's not a good idea to buy 10 tons of apples and hope that in 10 years it will have the same purchasing power. Money should be uniform. Uniform simply means that if you take 2 coins, 2 bills, or anything, or 2 kilograms of gold, for example, they should be exactly the same. They should have the same purchasing power. And actually, I have introduced that picture, and I want you to have a look at the side of the coin, you see? And you see those vertical lines on the side of the coin over there? Does anybody know what they are for? It's not just to be beautiful. Does anybody know what's the purpose of those vertical lines on the side of the coin? And while you are thinking or writing, I will plug my computer, which is out of battery. What is the purpose of those vertical lines on the side of coins? I don't know if it's the case for all coins, but I think it is the case. All right, what do we have? To stop clipping. Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. In the past, yeah, those coins were made of gold or silver. So they definitely had intrinsic value. And yes, some economic agents, not very honest, but smart, there were, I did not know the word in English, so thank you very much, clipping, or yeah, to shave down. That's very good, because I did not really know how we said that in English. Basically, to remove a little bit of the commodity from the side of the coin, okay? So scratching the coin to remove some of the gold, some of the silver. So which means that over time, coins would become lighter and lighter. And the new coins, they would essentially have more gold or more silver than the old coins. So in that case, these 2 units of money would not be uniform. Okay, and it's complicated because, of course, you need to have some kind of uniformity just to make sure that you can trust this asset to be a good medium of exchange and a good unit of account. So uniformity is mostly connected to the unit of account function of money. If you have several units of currencies that are different, so therefore they have a different purchasing power, at least theoretically, then money would not be a good unit of account. Money must be in limited supply Okay, we sometimes say money does not grow up on trees, but if this was the case, then of course it would not have any exchange value, simply because it would be so abundant that anybody could just have as much as they wanted. And in this case, this would make it absolutely worthless. So that's why we need something. Money must be something whose supply can be controlled and whose supply is not abundant. It's not a good idea to use sand or leaves as a form of money, because it is so abundant that its exchange value would be virtually zero. And the last property, and I already talked about that earlier, is money should be divisible, which means that we should be able to divide it into smaller denominations in order to be able to purchase goods and services of different values. Think about an economy in which we would only have 500 euros bills. Well, in that case, you clearly see the problem. There are very, very few products that cost exactly 500, 1,000, 1,500. So we need to have smaller denominations. So every possible good and so buyers, they can pay the exact amount for every possible good and services, even those who have a very low exchange value, just a few cents. That's the idea. Okay. All right. That's it. So make sure the trick here, the main trap is the students make the mistake between the functions of money and the characteristics of money. Of course, in order for money to be able to fulfill its functions, these characteristics must be satisfied, right? Especially if it's not acceptable, it's not a medium of exchange. If it's not portable, it's not going to be a medium of exchange either. If it's not durable, it's not going to be a good store of value. If it's not uniform, it's not going to be unit of account. If it's in limited supply, again, it's not going to be here a medium of exchange because its exchange value will be zero. And if it's not divisible, again, it's not going to be a good medium of exchange, and it's not going to be a good unit of account. So you see that this is connected. Those characteristics are required for money to be able to fulfill its functions. Any questions at that stage? Are we okay? Please let me know if there is anything that you would like me to explain, or if you have any questions so far. But we are almost done with money already. Are we good? Okay. So let's have a quick talk about the three types of money. So this is a bit beyond the syllabus, but I feel like this is very important to understand what are the three types of money, especially throughout history. Right now, we mostly use one single type of money, but throughout history, we've used different types. So the most ancient one is what we call commodity money, which is something that has what we call intrinsic value, means value in itself, okay, not value simply because you can buy other things with it. It has value in itself. You can consume it directly, or you can use it to produce something else, like gold. You can produce jewelry with it, with silver, same thing, shells, same thing. Well, that's mostly jewelry. Livestock, of course, you can produce meat. Cigarettes, you can simply consume them. This is a form or a type of money that we call commodity money. And this is what was used mostly in the past. And you see that, look at these assets, they were types of money, or they were examples of money in the past. And you can see that all of them, they meet the characteristics of money. Take silver or gold, you see that all the 6 characteristics are pretty much satisfied here. I gave the example of cigarettes to emphasize that even though this type of money is mostly gone, we don't really use commodity anymore today, it's not completely gone. And in particular, cigarettes can be used as a form of money in prisons. And it is a form of commodity money. So that's a good example of commodity money that is used today. Then the second in history, the second type of money that appeared was what we call representative or commodity-backed money, which is essentially often paper money. So it's like a piece of paper that you can use to buy goods and services. You can exchange it, no problem. But what makes it different from a banknote today is that you can exchange it for a valuable commodity, a commodity that has an intrinsic value at a fixed rate, and it is important, at a fixed rate, and anytime you want, on demand. Okay, so the best known example of commodity-backed money, and it's a pretty recent, so I think many of your students have heard of that, is what we call the gold standard. I'm not sure exactly, I forgot the date. I think it ended in the 1970s, right? 1971, am I right? Maybe you can tell me. Which was a system that allowed, to keep it simple, the conversion of the US dollar into gold at a fixed rate. Okay, so if you had a banknote, a US dollar, you could exchange it at any time you wanted against a fixed amount of gold. So in that case, that made the US dollar a form of representative money, a commodity-backed money. Okay, so then you're going to tell me, yeah, but even today, I can, of course, I can buy gold with a banknote. Yes, but first, it's not a fixed rate. Okay, it depends on the price of gold. Here, the idea is that you really have this fixed exchange rate between the valuable commodity and the banknote, if you want. I see a message in the chat. Was it that old? 1933. Okay, thank you, Mitchell. So the end of the gold standard. So I don't know why I thought this was after the. Was it the Bretton Woods conference? You see, I should review my economic history. Long time. But yeah, there was. Oh, you mean this is the beginning of the gold standard, Mitchell, or is this the end of the gold standard? I was talking about the end of the gold standard.
I think it was the end of the gold standard, just from what I see. I think it was like during the American Depression, and then the president wanted to like print a lot of money and do things like that. So
all right. So okay. So this. Thank you very much, Mitchell. But I hope you all understand the difference here. Yes, there is this fixed exchange rate. So yes, we use these tokens, that represent the commodity, but each token or each banknote has a corresponding value, a fixed corresponding value in terms of a valuable commodity. It could be gold, silver, copper, tobacco, any valuable commodity, fixed exchange rate between the token that represented. But yeah, therefore, after 1933, then the US dollar just stopped or abolished this, well, I don't really know how to phrase it, but after 1933, it was no longer possible to exchange US dollar for gold at a fixed exchange rate. Okay, so basically the US dollar, like for example, the banknotes, but not only the banknotes, the money that you had on your bank accounts and everything, was no longer convertible into gold at a fixed exchange rate. To put it simply, the US dollar was no longer backed by gold. Okay, that's why we said commodity backed. The US dollar was no longer backed by anything. And the only thing that made the US dollar valuable is the trust that people placed in it. And this is the case today with pretty much all currencies in the world. They are not backed by any form of valuable commodity. They do not have any intrinsic value. Okay, and the money that you have on your bank account, you've never actually seen it. It's not even physical, it's electronic. just 0 and 1s somewhere on a database. So the only thing that makes it valuable is that you trust that it will keep its purchasing power over time. You trust that it's a good store of value. You trust that it is a medium of exchange so that you will be actually able to exchange it for what you want. And you only have that trust because the government tells you that, yes, we're going to make sure that you will be able to use your money to buy goods and services, and we will control inflation, for example, to make sure that the purchasing power of your money is going to be preserved over time. This type of money that is not backed by any valuable commodity and that entirely relies on the trust that you have on its value is what we call fiat money. That's the last type of money. So it's a currency that is issued by the government. It has no intrinsic value. Okay, look at the bill, for example, it's just a piece of paper, and look at a dollar on your bank account. That's just a series of 0 and 1. So that there is no intrinsic value, and it is not backed by any form of valuable commodity. Okay, you cannot exchange it at a fixed rate at the central bank, for example. I don't really know in the US who was actually holding the gold. Was it the US Treasury? I don't know exactly, but there was essentially a place where you could actually go. Maybe there were several banks, I'm not sure. You could actually go there and you say, all right, $1 is a fixed quantity of gold, and you could trade that anytime you want. So yes, what makes it valuable is simply because we trust that, yes, we will be able to exchange this money for goods that we want, goods and services that we want. How do we make sure that I already talked about inflation? If we want people to trust fiat money, first, the government has to convince people that it will control inflation. Because if individuals, they see that prices tend to rise at a pretty high rate from one year to the other, they essentially see that this form of money, this fiat money, is losing purchasing power year after year. So this is something that can undermine the confidence that people place in fiat money. And that could even make it, so that makes it a worse store of value. This could also make a worse unit of account. Well, basically this damages all the functions of money. But something else that the government can do to increase the trust that people have in this form of money is to make it legal tender. Legal tender simply means that the government basically forces everyone to accept this type of money as a means of payment. All right. So if you walk into a business in pretty much any country in the world, if you go to France and if you walk into a grocery store, then the owner of the grocery store cannot refuse euros. Okay, because the euro is legal tender, which means that everyone is forced by law to accept it as a means of payment. And that is something that makes fiat money a very widely accepted form of payment, that makes it a good medium of exchange. Okay. All right, that's all for the forms type of money. Okay, I see another date. So what's August 1971? Okay, it began in 1933. And it ended in 1971. All right, so that's what I remembered. Okay.
Yeah, the President Franklin Roosevelt declared private ownership of gold illegal June 5th, 1933. So you could, unless it was jewelry, you couldn't own gold.
Okay.
So that was the beginning, and then Nixon formally got rid of the gold standard on the date you said.
Okay, all right. So that's what I had in mind, but I didn't know when it started. So thanks for sharing that information with us, Mitchell. So yeah, so now the US dollar, and just like any other currency in the world, I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't know any currency that is actually today backed by a valuable commodity, like a currency that is used by any country. But like the major currencies in the world today are all fiat money. The only thing that makes them valuable is the trust we place in them. That's it. Okay, last thing about money is the difference between narrow money and broad money. which is pretty simple. The only difference is that we include different types of assets depending on how liquid they are. What is liquidity? It's simply the ease with which you can convert an asset into cash. Or to be more precise, is it easy? Is it quick? And is there a loss of value when you convert your asset into cash? That's it. That's the definition of liquid. So for example, if you take a demand deposit, it is almost perfectly liquid, okay? Because you can just go to the closest ATM and you can withdraw your demand deposit. So a demand deposit is essentially the money that you have on your current account, on your checking account. That's what we call a demand deposit, because you can demand these funds anytime you want. However, a car is an asset that is not very liquid, because yes, of course, you can sell it, which is essentially to convert it into a cash, but it might take time. If you want to convert it as quickly as possible, you might have to cut the price at a pretty low level, so there might be a loss of value. So it's not as liquid as a demand deposit. If you take something like a time deposit, so a time deposit or something like a certificate of deposit is essentially an account on which you will put some money, and you will not be able to withdraw this money before a certain time. We call that the date of maturity. Could be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So this money cannot be used. And of course, the longer the maturity of your certificate of deposit, usually the higher the interest rate. Yeah. However, of course, if you really want to withdraw it, if you really want to convert it into cash, if there is an emergency, well, you can do it. But it might take some time, be a few days, and you will lose. Well, it depends, of course, but usually you will lose the interest that you have accumulated, or you will have to pay some penalties if you choose to withdraw your deposits before the date of maturity, which is something that makes this type of asset not very liquid. Okay, same thing. A house is definitely not liquid. You can convert it into cash, but it will take a long time. It might be very complicated to find a buyer, a lot of paperwork. So between the time where you decide to sell the house and the time where you actually receive the money on your bank account, it can take several months, years maybe. So it's definitely not liquid. So it's a good idea to try to discuss different assets with your students and say, well, what about this one? Do you think it's liquid? Do you think it's illiquid? So look at how much time it would take to convert it into cash, essentially to sell it. This is what it means. And look at whether the sale of this asset is likely to be associated with a loss of value or not. Of course, cash is perfectly liquid because it is cash. If we look at narrow money, we only look at these assets that we consider money that are very liquid. And I try to keep it simple. Again, in some books, even those endorsed by Cambridge, I find this very complicated, and they have given examples of assets that students have no idea about. So I try to keep it as simple as possible. So cash, of course, is perfectly liquid. It is the most perfect form of money in terms of its liquidity. So it includes banknotes and coins, and also the demand deposits, what I explained earlier. So could be the money that you have on your current account, could be the money that you have on your WeChat balance, on your Alipay balance, that works too. These are demand deposits. So these would be included in narrow money, because they are forms of money that are highly liquid. How about checkbooks and debit cards? Should they be considered to be money? And so, well, actually checkbooks, I think most students have no idea what this is. So usually what I do is that I still have my French checkbook here. So I usually take it with me so that I can actually see what it looks like, because I don't think I have ever seen anyone using a check in China. maybe old people. I don't know if this was something that was used in the past, but well, you can just explain what the check is, even though it's not really used anymore, at least not in China. I've never really seen that. Debit cards, even debit cards now, we don't really use that anymore, at least here in China. I have a debit card, I don't think I have ever used it for the last 4 years. Should they be considered money? No. They are simply instruments that we use to access our money, but they are not the money that we have itself. If you look at a checkbook or a debit card, they are simply ways, methods, instruments, tools that we use to transfer our demand deposits. Okay, so the money really is the demand deposits, the money we have on the bank account, and then we need ways to access it, to use it, to transfer it. And those checkbooks and those debit cards, they are instruments. Okay, they are the tools, but they are not the money itself. So we should not regard checkbooks and debit cards as a form of money. Credit cards is always a bit more complicated, but I'm not going to talk about that. But credit cards, in my opinion, again, should not be regarded as a form of money, because again, the credit card in itself is not money. It is simply a method that you can use to use the money that is currently held by the bank to buy something. And then of course you'll have to pay back the bank, but this is not your money. This is the money that is held by the bank. It's not, the credit card in itself is not a form of money. Okay, broad money is a bit less restrictive in the way it defines money. So of course it includes narrow money, but it also includes some other assets that are a bit less liquid. They are still relatively liquid, but are a bit less liquid. And we call these less liquid assets near money or quasi money. So we have broad money is just narrow money plus near money. And what do we call near money? They are financial assets. I don't think there are any physical assets that would be considered narrow, that would be considered a near money, so exclusively financial assets. They are not directly usable as a medium of exchange, not like cash, not like demand deposits. If you have cash or demand deposit, immediately you can use them to buy something. But they are still quite liquid, which means that it's quite easy to, if you have a near money, it's very easy to convert it into cash, to convert it into a demand deposit, and then to use these more liquid forms of money to buy something. Okay, so what examples should the students know? Again, in some books, they make it very complicated. I chose to list only 3. So savings account deposits, so the money that you have on your savings account and that you can readily convert into demand deposits. So for example, I have a savings account here in China, and that pays a pretty low interest rate. I cannot use it directly to buy goods and services. Okay, for example, I cannot connect it to my WeChat. I can only connect my current account to my WeChat, so which means that those savings account deposits are not a medium of exchange. But what I can do very easily, I can transfer these funds on my savings account into my current account, and then use these demand deposits to buy goods and services. It's very quick, just takes a few minutes. It's free. I don't lose the accumulated interest, so that makes savings account deposits highly liquid, even though I cannot directly use them to buy a good or service. So this is an example of a near money. Then you have the time deposits, and I talked about that, where the money is, like blocked, or is, deposited on an account for a certain amount of time, and you are not supposed to withdraw it before the date of maturity. It is still relatively liquid, but it's not perfectly liquid, because if you withdraw the money before the maturity date, then you might have to pay a penalty, and it might take some time as well. So it's a bit less liquid. And you could also give the example of foreign currencies. It's quite easy to understand. Of course, a foreign currency is not a medium of exchange. I cannot buy things in China with US dollars. But however, what I can do, I can walk into a bank or currency exchange store, and I can trade my US dollar for RMB, and then quite easily I can buy goods and services here in China. So of course, it might take some time, and I might have to pay some fees for the conversion, so it's not perfectly liquid. There are other examples, but I find the other examples more complicated, and I don't think it's really necessary for the AS students to go beyond that at that stage. And finally, a summary with this diagram that summarizes narrow money, so it's like the inner circle, cash plus demand deposits. Then the bigger circle, broad money, and you see that the difference, so let's say this area there is what we call near money. So yes, narrow money plus near money is indeed equal to broad money. And that is the end of this chapter on money. Of course, you have, as always, let me briefly show you the documents that you have available on the website. You have the summary, everything that you need to know, that the students need to know about money in only 3 pages, or even actually 2, almost 2, you see. So, yeah. The definitions, pretty much 1 page of definitions. The essay question, the concept cards, only 5 here, plus a drawing challenge, a shark, and the essay questions that relate to money. Okay, any questions? Any questions about money before we talk about demand? So demand is going to take us about, probably 30, 40 minutes. Supply is going to be very, very fast. And I'm just going to talk about the determinants because otherwise it's essentially the same, right? Any questions about money before we talk about demand? No questions? Okay. Let's do this. All right, that should be quick because really that's easy. I'll just emphasize the mistakes that your students must avoid. All right, first, clear definition. We are talking about the effective demand, okay, not the concept, the notional demand. So the effective demand, but it's okay if you just say the demand for a good or service, is the quantity that price-taking buyers. I think it's important to mention that most books, they forget to mention that, but the concept of demand only makes sense when the buyers have no influence on the price. Just like the concept of supply only makes sense when the sellers have no influence on the price. So buyers, they take a price as given, okay? And they just say, all right, if the price is this, then I will buy this. If the price is this, I will buy that. But I don't have, there is nothing I can do to influence that price. I take it as given. Okay, so that buyers are willing and able. So of course, that's the important thing that you really have to emphasize. It's one thing to be willing to buy something, yeah, because yeah. And it's another to be able to. Okay, I am willing to buy, I don't know, a very expensive car. Okay. Am I able to purchase a very expensive car? No. So in this case, even if I want something very bad, if I don't have the financial ability to purchase it, Okay. Is this working now? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Okay. Was there a moment where you could not hear me anymore? You lost about 1.5 minutes. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I didn't touch anything. All right, so let me just go back 1.5 minutes. I was saying that, yeah, it's not enough, of course, to want something. If you want something very bad, but if you don't actually have the ability to purchase it, you will have no effective demand for it. If I may want a very expensive car, but if I cannot afford it, then I have no effective demand. And yes, essentially the buyers, they look at the price and they have to decide how much to buy in order to achieve what? In order to maximize their utility. This is what happens in the mind of consumers, and this is the assumption that we make. Consumers make decisions to maximize their utility, and producers, by assumption, they often make decisions to maximize their profit. So essentially, a demand curve will show all the points that maximize the consumer's total utility, and a supply curve will show all the points, price quantity combinations that maximize the seller's profit. Okay, this is how this works. Right. Okay, so you have an example, of course. Keywords, a demand schedule. So demand schedule is just a table where you have the quantity demanded at any price, simple. And the demand curve is simply the graphical representation of the demand schedule. Okay, so table, diagram. Here it is. Where is it? Where is my diagram? Oh, I probably deleted it by mistake. I used to have, oh no, it's there. All right, so that's a demand schedule. And that's a demand curve. All right, here's the difference. And of course, it's downward sloping because of the law of demand. Very important, of course. Make sure they get this right. So the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. So the demand curve is downward sloping, of course. You can I use and vice versa a lot, so that's a good opportunity to explain what this is. Essentially, vice versa means that the opposite is true. Yeah, so this means that an increase in price leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded, and a decrease in price leads to an increase in the quantity demanded. I like to use this because it allows you to not repeat the sentence just the other way around. It's just quicker. But make sure your students understand how this works. Yeah. So yes, the demand is downward sloping. We say there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Then you can ask them, hey, why do you think this is the case? So essentially, they are the reason for which the demand curve is downward sloping. We will see that in A2 when we will look at the substitution effect and the income effect. But you can just discuss this with them without mentioning this key term specifically. You can simply say, hey, look, if the price is lower, then that means that the product becomes relatively more attractive compared with other products. Yeah. So you want to buy more of it. And on the other hand, if the price rises, the product becomes relatively more expensive. It is less attractive compared with other products. So you have an incentive to buy less. In A2, we will see that this is what we call the substitution effect. And this is one reason for which the demand curve is downward sloping. And then you have another reason that we will know as the income effect in A2, which is about the impact of a change in price on your purchasing power. If the price of something decreases, this means that your purchasing power rises, so you can buy more. And if the price rises, that means that your purchasing power decreases and you will be likely to buy less. Of course, assuming we are dealing with a normal good. We'll see that pretty soon. But yeah, these are essentially the two things. The change in price makes the product more or less attractive in terms of relatively to other goods. That's a substitution effect. And a change in price affects your purchasing power. And assuming that the good is normal, because most goods are normal, this is another reason for which the demand is likely to be downward sloping. It's not always the case. There are two exceptions. In A2, again, this is a bit beyond the syllabus, but you can ask them, do you think it's always the case? Are you always going to buy more of something if the price decreases? Are you always going to buy less of something if the price rises? There are two exceptions, main exceptions in economic theory. And the first one is what we call the Veblen goods, or the snob effect, where you basically buy something because it is expensive. And it's one way to like show your wealth, for example. Because basically this is a good that can show your social status. This is in the practices of conspicuous consumption, where you buy something just to show the world what you can afford. Could be very expensive watches, Louis Vuitton purses, things like that. So in that case, an increase in price might actually lead to an increase in the quantity demanded. And the second case where the demand might actually be upward sloping is the Giffen goods. Well, we'll see that later, because they are very specific goods that are inferior goods, such that the income effect is greater than the substitution effect. So don't explain anything about Giffen goods, just say that there is a type of good that we will study in A2 that does not satisfy the law of demand. Okay, you can explain the Veblen good, but the Giffen good, just say we'll see in A2. Right, then you have your demand schedule, you have your demand curve, and then very important, you need to explain your students what is the difference between a movement along the demand curve and a shift of the demand curve. Generally speaking, if we look at this diagram, but not only for a demand curve diagram, could be any diagram, if you change the variable that is labeled on the vertical axis, then you're going to move along the curve. Okay, could be price, could be anything that is labeled on the vertical axis. If you change its value, you're going to move along this curve. If you change anything else that has an influence on what you graph, then that's going to be a shift where the entire curve is going to move. Okay, so here what is labeled on the vertical axis is the price. Okay, so if we change the price of the product, then there will be a change in the quantity demanded. They will not be, we have to be very, very, very careful with the vocabulary that we use here, because there is a difference between change in quantity demanded and change in demand. Okay, a change in demand is when the entire curve shifts either to the right or to the left. A change in quantity demanded simply means that you either consume more of something or demand more of something or less of something at a given price. Okay, so that leads to a change in quantity demanded and are associated with movements along the demand curve. Could be a movement up along the demand curve if you increase the price, or it could be a movement down along the demand curve if you cut the price. So I just emphasize it again because students still make mistakes. If you change the product price, this will not lead to changes in demand, because as I said, a change in demand is a shift of the entire curve. They are not associated with shifts of the demand curve. So as I said, if you if we decrease the price, then we are going to move down along the demand curve. And as a result, the quantity demanded will increase at this lower price. This increase in quantity demanded, we call that an extension of demand. And if you increase the price, so we move up along the demand curve and the quantity demanded will be lower at the higher price, we call that a contraction of demand. So you have two diagrams that illustrate these two cases. So here, decrease in price leads to an increase in quantity demanded. This is an extension of demand represented by a movement down along the demand curve. And the opposite case, where you have an increase in price that leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded. That's a contraction of demand associated with a movement up along the demand curve. All right, so we move along it, but the curve has not shifted. Right, simple. However, if you change anything else that influences the demand, but anything else that is not the price, then the demand curve is going to shift. Could be either to the right, which means that at any given price, people or consumers will buy more, or we say that the demand increases in that case, or it's going to shift to the left, which indicates that at any given price, consumers are going to purchase less. That's a decrease in demand. And all these factors that make the demand curve shift, we call that the determinants of demand. Sometimes we call that the conditions of demand, but I don't really like conditions. I like determinants of demand. And okay. So if it shifts to the right, that's an increase in demand. If it shifts to the left, it's a fall or decrease in demand. Simple. And these are the main determinants of demand that your students must know. The two first ones, income and the price of substitutes or complements in consumption, are very important. The rest may be a bit less important, but still they should be able to provide examples of these other examples. But I will mostly focus on the first one, income and the price of substitutes and complements. So what will happen to the demand curve if we change income, if we increase or decrease income? Well, it might be tempting, and you can ask that to your students. You can say, hey, if you have more income, are you going to buy more of a good or service, or are you going to buy less? Those who have taken IGCSE, they should see the trap. Otherwise, they are likely to tell you, if you have more income, you buy more. Well, usually it's true. And in that case, we are dealing with a normal good. Okay, normal good, your income rise, you buy more, your income falls, you buy less. So, okay, that works. But there are other examples of good that we call inferior goods, for which is the opposite. If your income rises, you buy less, and if it decreases, you buy more. So it's there are not so many examples of convincing examples of inferior goods, but what you should try to emphasize is that it doesn't really have to do with quality. All right, you should not really introduce inferior goods as goods of bad quality. It's not really that. It really is about the consumption patterns and about how consumers modify their consumption when their income changes. And it's not always the case that they will necessarily move to something of a higher quality. So let me just give you my two favorite examples. I've not given the examples here. All right, my two favorites. So for normal goods, no problem, right? There are plenty of examples. But examples of inferior goods, I give these two. I give the example of bus tickets, simply because if you are very rich, it's not likely that you will travel by bus. I would assume that most people have their own car, or they use other means of transportation. Maybe they will take a cab or something like that. I don't think that you will see many billionaires in buses, which means that essentially the more income you have, the more likely it is that you will use, and generally speaking, public transportation. What they say, the less income you have, the more likely it is that you will use public transportation, which makes public transportation, and I like to take the example of bus tickets, a good example of an inferior good. The second example that I like to use is potatoes. Why? Because potatoes are very cheap and they have a lot of nutrients. You could actually survive only by eating potatoes, I believe. I heard about a guy in India who's claimed he had only lived on potatoes for 40 years or something like that. So, well, assuming you have a very, very low income, and maybe not right now, but in the past, this was true. People used to eat a lot of potatoes. People that had a very low income, they ate a lot of potatoes. It was cheap and a lot of nutrients. When your income rises, you might say, oh, finally, I can afford something else than potatoes. So your demand for potatoes might actually decrease as your income rises. You might try to diversify your diet a bit and purchase more meat and more vegetables and things that you truly enjoy. So I like these two examples of inferior goods, bus tickets or public transportation in general, and potatoes. So then I have this table here that summarizes everything. So you can fill it with your students. I think in the student version of the PPT, it's blank. So you can get your students to fill that table. So if you increase income, in the case of a normal good, the demand increases. So the R between brackets means it's a shift to the right. Okay, rightward shift of the demand curve. If you decrease income, the demand for a normal good will decrease, leftward shift. And in the case of inferior goods, of course, it's the opposite. Here's the representation. All right, so normal good, we increase income, the demand increases, shift to the right. Be careful with the shifts. I don't like when sometimes students, they do this type of shift, like something like that, and they make the arrow in this direction, like not exactly right, but like to the northeast. Yeah, well, I don't really like it. I think it's better to really make it like a rightward shift, okay, to really emphasize that at any given price the quantity demanded is higher. So please encourage your students to shift it to the right and not to the northeast. I think it's better to put it this way. All right, so side by side for normal good and inferior good. So you see that the consequence is opposite, of course. And the same thing with when the income decreases. All right, you have all the possible cases. I represented all possible cases. Then you have a second determinant is the price. The second very important determinant is the price of related goods. So here by related goods, I mean substitutes and complements. That's it. In consumption, because there are also substitutes and complements in production. So first, let's start with some definitions. Two goods are substitutes in consumption, or we also say in competitive demand, if consumers can replace one by the other. Okay, it doesn't mean that they are identical. If they are absolutely identical, we call that perfect substitute, but this basically means that they can serve pretty much the same purpose. Okay, so if you have a, I don't know, if you are thirsty, you can have water, or you can have I don't know, milk, or you can have beer. Okay, these are not perfect substitutes, but they are relatively close substitutes. Well, maybe not for water and beer. All right, examples. And then let's try to see, okay, what happens, because of course, what interests us here is to understand what's going to affect the demand for a product. The idea here is that what happens if you change the price of good Y, what's going to happen to the demand for good X? Well, again, just take an example. You take tea and sugar, and so, right, so the price of tea increases. So what are consumers going to do? They are going to buy less tea because it's more expensive, right? If the price of tea rises. So instead, they can buy more coffee. So when the price of tea rises, the demand for coffee increases. Boom, you got it. Then you can take the case of two complements. Although in consumption, we say that they are in joint demand because they must be consumed together. So again, there are several degrees of complements. Sometimes they are products that must be consumed together. For example, if you only have a coffee machine, but you don't have coffee beans, well, that's going to be a problem. But sometimes there are goods that are simply better if they are together, but it's still okay if you only have one. If you have fries, but no ketchup or no mayonnaise, well, that's still okay, right? You can still eat your fries, even if it would be better to have a ketchup or whatever would you like to put with your fries, right? So there are complements that are very close complements, complements that are remote complements. But essentially, take sugar and coffee. The price of coffee increases. So what are we going to do? We're going to buy less coffee. That's because of the law of demand. And because we buy less coffee, we don't need to buy as much sugar as before. So the demand for coffee is going to decrease. So when the price of coffee increases, the demand for sugar decreases. All right. Now you should really stop there and ask pretty much each of your students, if you can. I don't know how many students you have, but to do this type of example. All right. Choose two goods. Could be complements, could be substitutes, and tell me what happens if, boom, the price increases. What's going to happen to the demand for the other good? Stop there and make sure that they get it right. You have a summary, just like, sorry. where is my, okay. You have a summary here, so same thing. The case where the two goods are substitutes, the case where the two goods are complements, increase and decrease in price. So we change the price of Y and we look at the consequence on the demand for good X. Okay, so well, same thing. I think this table is empty in the student version, so your students can fill it. And you have the diagrams, same thing. So this is the case of substitutes and complements when the price of good Y rises. And then you have the same thing, substitutes and complements when the price of good Y decreases. Okay, so again, you have all the possible cases. And then you have other determinants on which we spend less time. So what I did, I simply mentioned them and give an example for each. So for the number of buyers, of course, the more buyers there are in a market, the higher the demand. The fewer buyers there are, the lower the demand. That makes sense. Preferences. So you can say, of course, if consumer preferences, if their willingness to purchase a product changes, then of course it's going to have an influence on the demand. So fads, for example, have a very significant influence on demand. And what you can do is to ask your students, okay, what's the latest fad, the latest trend, thing that is trendy right now at school that everybody wants to have? This could be, I don't know, a particular piece of clothing, a particular brand. It could be, I don't know, a particular type of jewelry, electronic device, and just ask them, okay, what's the latest trend? And then you can very easily convince them, hey, look, the demand for this particular product has dramatically increased over the last month, for example, but there will be a point where it will no longer be trendy, and then the demand is going to decrease because nobody wants to buy this anymore. When I worked on this PPT, the thing that was trendy, well, that was a long time ago, were the hand spinners. Does anybody know what this is? Well, I guess you are older than most of my students, so you should remember what we call hand spinners, right? I remember there was a time everybody had that. Everybody had one. Now, when is the last time you saw this? When was the last time you saw hand spinner? And I guess the demand for hand spinners is probably close to zero right now because it has just been, it's just like obsolete or not fashionable anymore. So yes, changes in preferences have a very important sentiment. Could be legislation. Could be that the government forces people to buy something or prevents people from buying something. For example, in France, a few years back, the government has required every home to be equipped with a smoke detectors. We call that fire detectors. I think in English we say smoke detectors, right? So of course, if the government tells you must equip your apartment, your house with a smoke detector, well, you can imagine that the demand for smoke detectors has very much increased because of this regulation, because of this legislation. Expectations is about what you think will happen in the future. Could be your income, your future income, or it could be the future price of something. Say if you expect that you will be fired, that you will lose your job, so you expect your income to fall, then you might actually reduce your consumption in order to be able to save more. So the demand for certain goods and services might decrease today. Or if you expect the government, in my example, to subsidize the purchase of solar panels next year, well, then you should wait, right? You should not purchase solar panels today. You should wait until the subsidy is in place so you can benefit from it, which means that if everybody waits until next year, the demand for solar panels today is likely to decrease. And of course, advertising. Actually, I could have merged it with preferences because the purpose of advertising is to influence consumer preferences, but I separated it. I don't know why, but why not? So of course, companies, they invest massive amounts of money to influence consumer preferences, and if it is successful, to increase their demand. Okay, right, and that's pretty much the end of demand already. Then what you have is an exercise where we look at the demand for coffee, and I give 6 different situations, changes essentially, and I ask the students, okay, show me what happens. Is this going to be a movement along the demand curve? Is this going to be a shift? If it's a movement along, is it going to be an extension? Is it going to be a contraction? If it's a shift, is it going to be an increase in demand or a decrease in demand? So we look at the price of coffee. So in the student version, of course, you just have the set of axes, but they are blank, so your students can actually practice directly on the PPTs. So decrease in the price of coffee, of course, it's a movement along, it's an extension of demand. Increase in quantity demanded, not an increase in demand. Increase in the price of sugar, so sugar is a complement, okay? So if the sugar becomes more expensive, you buy less sugar and therefore you buy less coffee. Well, maybe it doesn't make much sense, but at least theoretically, if we assume that they are complements, that works. So you buy less coffee, so the demand falls. It's a leftward shift. Tea is a substitute, so if the price of tea increases, we buy less tea and therefore we buy more coffee. So the demand for coffee increases. That's a rightward shift. A decrease in the price of leather. So I did this on purpose. Leather has nothing to do with coffee, right? Unless you have, I don't know, mugs made out of leather. But yeah, here there is no relationship. There is no connection between coffee and leather. They are independent. So a change in the price of leather will not have any influence on the demand for coffee. So nothing will change. This was just there to trick them. An increase in income of the average coffee drinker. I think I indicated that coffee is normal good. Yes, you see, coffee is a normal good. So here, if you have an increase in the income of the average coffee drinker, because coffee is a normal good, the demand will increase. Rightward shift. And the last one about consumer preferences, a new scientific study finds that too much caffeine can cause anxiety. So that's a bad news. So this might discourage some people to drink coffee or at least reduce their consumption. So this might lead to a decrease in demand, rightward shift. Okay. And the last thing that we have to do about demand very quickly is to understand the difference between an individual demand and a market demand, which is, well, quite straightforward. An individual demand is just the relationship between price and quantity demanded by one person, essentially, one individual buyer. And the market demand curve, it's a relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, but by all the buyers in the market. So it's basically the sum, right? We add all the individual demand curves of all the buyers in the market, and we end up with the market demand curve. We call that the horizontal sum because in the diagram, you'll see that we add the demand curves horizontally, not vertically. I can show you the diagram quickly. Okay, so these are my 3 individual demand curves. So each demand curve is one individual. And I will add this, but not vertically, but horizontally. You see, if I add that, you can look at the numbers. It took me a lot of time to draw this diagram precisely, but the numbers work. If I add at any price 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, all the individual quantities, I end up with the market demand. So for example, if I look at, all right, so here's the table. So I have 3 individual buyers, Jonathan, Thomas, Benjamin in this market. And for each of them, I give the quantity demanded at the price of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And of course, if I add this quantity, I get the market demand. So for example, when the price is 30, Jonathan is willing and able to buy 60. Thomas is willing and able to buy 30. And Benjamin is able and willing to buy 60. So overall, if my math is correct, the market, how do we say? It's not really the market demand, but the quantity demanded in the market at that price is 150 units, which is exactly what we see there, right? At 30, who's that? Thomas, 30, and Jonathan and Benjamin, 60. So overall, 150. Okay, that works. So this is a market demand, like the total demand, if you want. And these are the individual demand curves. You see that above this, the quantity demanded is 0. That's why it becomes vertical. So yeah, that's why we say that the market demand curve is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves of all buyers in a particular market. Horizontal sum. We add the demand curve, if you want, along the horizontal axis. And that's it. Of course, you have all the documents, so let's just compare a few things. So here you have 116 slides, teacher's version, student version, only 30. You have the definitions. Do we have a lot of definitions? Ooh, it's a bit, my computer is slow tonight. You have the definitions, yeah, quite a few definitions that relate to demand. You have the concept cards. Let's have a look at the drawing challenge. What is the drawing challenge here? Mickey Mouse. You have the summary. So where is it? So how many pages? 4 pages with all diagrams, all definitions, all explanations. Look at that. 4 pages, everything they need to know about demand. Everything. It's there. So you have everything. And the essay questions, of course. All the essay questions that relate to demand. Any questions? Before we move on and talk about supply, but of course, supply, I'm going to skip most of it because it's just the same, right? Just reverse everything. I will simply focus on the determinants of supply because the rest is just the same. Any questions before we have a look at the last PPT about supply? Are we okay? All right. Right, so the definition again, I'm not gonna go through that again. Same thing here. Sellers don't really want to maximize satisfaction. The objective is that we assume that they make decisions for any given price. They have to decide how much to sell, how much to supply in order to maximize their profit. Okay, that's the difference. Then it's just the same. You have an example, supply schedule, supply curve, the law of supply, which is the opposite of the law of demand. Here, there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Okay, so the higher the price, the greater the quantity supplied. So the supply curve is upward sloping. Why is this the case? So it's not really about income effect and substitution effect here. The idea is that the higher the price, the more units become profitable. Okay, if the price is very low, there will be very few sellers who find it profitable to sell something. Only those who have a very low cost of production, only those who are very efficient at producing the product will say, yeah, okay, even if the price is very low, I can still make some profit by selling a few units. Okay, but as the price rises, you will have more and more businesses that will find it profitable to produce and sell, even if they are a bit less cost efficient as the other ones. All right, so the higher the price, the more firms can make profit when producing, the greater the, and that's actually what we call the incentive function of the price mechanism. The higher the price, the more incentives for firms to produce and sell their products, and that's why the supply curve is upward sloping. You have an example of a supply schedule. You have an example of the corresponding supply curves. Here, it's exactly the same as demand. I just copied and pasted and just replaced demand by supply. Okay, so that's exactly the same thing. A change in price does not make the supply curve shift. We move along it. If we go, so careful now, if we move up along the supply curve, it's going to be an extension. Okay, because the quantity supplied increases. But if we move down along the supply curve, it's going to be a contraction because the quantity supplied decreases. So this is, oh, what did I do? This is a contraction. This is a contraction of supply. this is an extension of supply because the quantity supplied increases. All right, the determinants, this is what changes. This is what is different from demand. But of course, it's the same idea. The determinants are anything that affects, that influences the supply curve other than price. And they are associated with shifts, okay? They make the entire supply curve shift. If it shifts to the right, it's an increase in supply because the quantity supplied is higher at any given price. And if it shifts to the left, it's a decrease in supply because the quantity supplied is lower at any given price. So these are the main determinants that your students must know. Input price is very important, productivity very important. This one a bit less. Taxes and subsidies, it's also very important. Do not give too many details about taxes and subsidies because we will spend more time on this later, but it's important that at least we give some basic information about the impact of taxes and subsidies on the supply curve. So let's focus on input prices and productivity. So the input prices could be the price of labor, wages, the price of steel, the price of oil, things like that. And of course, the idea here is that when these resources, when these inputs are very expensive, this means that the cost of production is very high and firms will not be willing to sell a lot unless the price is very high. Okay, so let's say that you were willing to sell 100 units of your product when the price is $10, but if you have an increase in the price of, let's say, the price of labor, an increase in wages, this increases your cost of production a lot. And if the price of the product remains the same, $10, you might not be able to produce as much, or you might not be willing to produce as much. So an increase in your input price means that your cost of production increases. And in that case, you will be able and willing to supply less at any given price. So an increase in input price will make your supply curve decrease and vice versa. For example, a car manufacturer faces an increase in the price of steel. Okay, you will require a higher price for you to be willing to supply the same quantity as before. Just give me a sec. I see someone in the waiting room. It's a bit late to join us. A very late registration. Just give me 30 seconds just to sort this out. All right. Not registered. All right, let's continue. All right, so you get, oops, okay, so you get the idea, right? Essentially, anything that will increase your cost of production will lead to a decrease in supply. Anything that will decrease your cost of production will increase the supply. You will be willing to produce more units at any given price. Of course, the price of inputs depends on the market conditions, but it can also be influenced by the government. Okay, for example, a minimum wage will definitely have an impact on the price of labor. Tariffs will have a significant impact on the price of all commodities that businesses import, just like gas or oil or even steel or anything like that that we import. The price of these inputs can be affected by tariffs. Productivity also influence the cost of production. Okay, the more productive your inputs, the lower the cost of production, the per unit cost of production, and therefore for the same reason, it's going to shift your supply curve. So the productivity can be influenced by the state of technology, can be influenced by the level of human capital, could be influenced by weather conditions, and so on, of course. And if you have an increase in productivity, this means that your per unit cost of production is actually lower. Okay, it's just like a decrease in the price of inputs. The consequence is the same, lower cost of production. And if you have a lower cost of production, you will be able and willing to supply more output at any given price. So the supply curve will increase, shift to the right. However, if you have a decrease in productivity, your average cost of production will increase. And therefore, at any given price, you will be willing and able to supply less output. So yes, I give an example. If you have better technology, this decreases your cost of production, unit cost of production. So you want to produce more. This is all right. This is what happens when the input prices change. Could be a decrease or an increase in the price of an input. In the first case, the decrease in the price of the input leads to an increase in supply. In the second case, the increase in the price of an input leads to a decrease in supply. And that's productivity. Okay, but same idea, just a graphical representation. Okay, the price of related goods. So we are again talking about substitutes and complements, but here we are not talking about substitutes and complements in consumption, but substitutes and complements in production. Okay, so let's make sure that we understand what this is. We say that two goods are substitutes in production if essentially you can produce them with the same resources, but it's one or the other. Okay, they are not produced at the same time. For example, you have a field, you have some workers with you, you have some I don't know, some equipment like a tractor and some tools. So you could use all these resources to produce, I don't know, strawberries, or to produce I don't know, something like raspberries. Why not? Okay, so essentially they require the same resources. But if you use your resources to produce more strawberries, then you will have to produce less raspberries and vice versa. So they are substitutes in production. Okay, so corn versus soybeans, four-door sedans versus pickup trucks. All right, you get the idea. So what's the relationship here? Let's say that we can either, we have a field and we can either produce corn or soybeans. And let's assume that the price of soybeans increases. Well, if you are smart, you should say, all right, then soybeans has become more profitable. Okay, I can get more money by producing soybeans, so I should use more resources to produce more soybeans. I should use, for example, more of my field to grow soybeans. Maybe before I had 50% of my field to grow corn and 50% to grow soybeans. Now I should use a 75% for soybeans and only 25% for corn, right? So clearly, if the price of a substitute in production rises, the business will produce more of the substitute in production and therefore less of the initial product itself. So to use the example of corn and soybeans, an increase in the price of soybeans will lead to a decrease in the supply of corn. Okay, makes sense? And complements, it's the same. So complements, it's a bit different. There are two products that are produced at the same time using the same resources. Okay, it's not one or the other. It's like, we call that joint supply because they are jointly produced. They are produced simultaneously. The typical example is beef and leather. Of course, if you produce beef at the same time, you produce leather, okay, or at least the raw material to produce leather. If you produce honey, of course, at the same time, you produce beeswax. Okay, it's the same production process. Like beeswax is a byproduct of honey. Leather is a byproduct of beef. Sawdust is a byproduct of lumber. So that's when we talk about joint supply, yes, we are mostly talking about byproducts. So in this case, let's say that the price of beef increases. Again, the incentive function of the price mechanism means that firms want to produce more beef. Okay, so if they produce more beef, they will also produce more of the byproducts. They will also at the same time produce more leather, which means that when the price of beef increases, the supply of leather will also increase. Okay, and I could do the same example if the price of beef decreases. That's the basic idea. So you have the explanation, and of course you have the diagrams. So these are the case of complements in production when the price rises, substitutes in production when the price rises, and then the same thing when the price decreases. All cases. All right, then the last determinant, and then I think we'll be done for tonight. Expectations, the number of sellers. So expectations is mostly our anticipations about the future price of what we sell. If we sell something whose price is expected to rise in the future, then we should wait until we sell it. Okay, we should store it and wait until the price rises, so we can make more money, right? And however, if we expect that the price is going to decrease in the future, then we should sell as fast as possible, okay? Or we should try to sell our inventory as quickly as possible. A good example that I give is the barbecue meat. I don't know, maybe not a good example in China, but I guess in most Western countries, we like to do barbecues mostly in summer, which means that the demand for barbecue meat is very, very high during summer, which means that the price of meat is usually quite high. And what businesses sometimes do, because they produce meat throughout the entire year, right? They don't produce just more meat in summer. So what they do, if they produce meat in winter, they usually freeze a lot of it. So because the price is quite low during winter, so then they can sell their inventory, their stock of meat at a higher price during summer. So of course, our expectations in terms of the future price of something have an influence on how much we want to sell today. Same thing with financial assets like stocks, cryptocurrencies. I again give the example of a Bitcoin. If you feel like the price of Bitcoin is going to increase, well, nobody is going to sell today. The supply is going to be very low, right? But if everybody believes that the price is going to decrease, well, everybody's going to sell. Well, maybe not everybody, but the weaker hands are going to sell. So that's another example of how expectations can affect the current supply. And the number of sellers, of course, it's straightforward. The more sellers in the market, the higher the supply. Of course, the number of sellers is affected by a variety of factors. Many of them can actually be controlled by the government. Could be competition law, could be intellectual property, could be buffer stocks. So many of these factors that have an influence on the number of sellers are actually controlled or at least influenced by the government. And then, of course, you have all the corresponding diagrams that illustrate all the possible cases. Oh, I forgot about that. I forgot about taxes and subsidies. That's the last one. Short introduction. Don't say too much about taxes and subsidies. We'll talk about that later in the chapter on government microeconomic intervention. But let's just say, yes, an indirect tax is a tax on a good or service, okay? And just briefly mention a tax can be specific or ad valorem. Specific, it just means it's a given amount for each unit, and that's, I don't really like the word specific. I like per unit. I think it's easier, right? A per unit tax, it makes more sense. So yeah, we pay a fixed amount for every unit that is sold. The business is going to, the firm, the seller is going to give a certain amount of money to the government for each and every single unit of a product that is sold. So it could be, for example, $2 per pack of cigarettes. It doesn't matter what the price of the product is, right? Just a given amount per unit. So what matters is the volume, not the value. And on the other hand, but it's not really necessary to look at that right now, an ad valorem tax is a tax that is proportional to the price, okay? So the amount that we pay is, depend on the value, not on the volume of the good or service. And they are the most common indirect taxes, GST, VAT, and so on. But again, let's just leave these aside for now. And let's just focus for now on specific taxes and subsidies. I'm not going to say too much about subsidies because they work the same as taxes, just reverse everything. A subsidy is just a negative tax. Okay, well, it's a tax that has a negative rate. That's it. So what happens if we introduce a specific tax in the market? Every time the seller is making a sale, it has to pay a given amount to the government. Okay, that's it. So the consequence is that this is gonna increase the cost of production, the marginal cost of production, and if you include the sale, right, by an amount that is exactly equal to the specific tax. So the supply curve is going to shift. You could say to the left, but if you want to be more precise, it's actually going to shift upward by an amount that is exactly equal to the specific tax. And I think it's better to represent the shift as an upward shift rather than the leftward shift, because you know that later when we will talk about tax incidence, it's important to understand that the vertical distance between the initial supply curve and the final supply curve is equal to the per unit tax. So I recommend that you represent the shift of the supply curve as an upward or downward, in the case of the subsidy, shift, rather than a leftward, rightward shift. Okay, so yes, the vertical distance between the before tax and after tax supply curve is exactly equal to the per unit tax. And yes, why does it lead to an upward shift of the supply curve? Essentially because it's like if the marginal cost of production had increased by exactly the amount of the tax. So that's how we can graph it. So this would be here where we decrease the rate of a specific tax, because yes, we can introduce a tax, but once the tax is there, we can change the rate, right? We can increase the rate of a specific tax. In this case, this would lead to an upward shift of the supply curve, okay, which means that at any given price, the quantity supplied is lower. So you can call that a decrease in supply. But we can also decrease the tax rate. Okay, we could say, all right, VAT used to be 20%. That's VAT is actually a bad example. We initially had a $2 tax on each pack of cigarettes, and now we only have a $1 tax on each pack of cigarette. In this case, you have a decrease in the tax rate, and this would be represented by a downward shift of your supply curve. And of course, the vertical distance that you have between these two curves is exactly equal to the change in the tax rate. Okay, that's it. So here the decrease, the downward shift of the supply curve indicates that there is an increase in supply. Okay, you see that at P0, the quantity supplied used to be Q1, now it's Q2, so the quantity supplied has increased at this price and at any given price actually. And exactly the same thing for subsidies. So I just copied everything and I just replaced tax by subsidy. So that's the same idea. We just reverse everything and we obtain the result with a subsidy. So this is what happens if we introduce a subsidy or if we increase the rate of a subsidy. And this is what happens if we remove a subsidy or if we decrease the rate of a subsidy. The diagram on the left-hand side is an increase in supply, because you see that the quantity supplied increases at any given price. On the left-hand side, this is a decrease in supply because the quantity supplied decreases at any given market price. And look what I did. Yeah, I did this summary of everything, like all the possible determinants. And then what if it increases or decreases? Productivity, input prices, price of a substitute, price of a complement, indirect tax, indirect subsidy, number of sellers, anticipated future price. Same thing, I think in the student version, I left it blank so your students can fill it themselves. And again, R stands for right, L stands for left. So careful, U is up and D is down, okay? But it's okay, honestly, if you want to say left, right for the tax, if this confuses you or if you feel like your students might be confused about that, it's absolutely okay. If you say a tax will shift supply left, a subsidy will shift it right. I like to be more precise, but depends on whether your students can take it or not. All right, and then you have exercises. So here we look at the supply of pizzas. And you have how many? 5 cases. Increase in the price of tomatoes. So tomato is an input. So this means that an input becomes more expensive. So supply will decrease because my cost of production increases. So that's a leftward shift of the supply curve. Faster pizza ovens, this means an increase in the state of technology, an improvement in productivity. If productivity improves, then the cost of production per unit decreases. So my supply curve increases, shift to the right. An effective maximum price on pizza, this means that the government essentially forces pizza sellers to reduce the price. Okay, so the price maybe before the maximum price was PA, now it's PB. Okay, so this leads to a movement down along the supply curve. That's a contraction of supply. An increase in the price of bread, a substitute in production. Okay, we could use everything, all the resources that we have to produce pizzas, we could also use them to produce bread. Why not? So this means that bread becomes more valuable. So we have an incentive to produce more bread, to use more of our resources to produce more bread. And therefore we have less resources available to produce pizzas. So the supply will decrease. Okay, that's a decrease in supply. And the introduction of a fat tax. So a fat tax is essentially a tax imposed on junk food. We can consider pizzas as a type of junk food. So in that case, the introduction of a fat tax is going to shift the supply curve upward, which is a decrease in supply. Okay, at any given price, the quantity supplied will be lower. And the vertical distance between these two curves is exactly equal to the fat tax rate. Okay, oh, I did this again. Sorry, it's repetitive. I'll delete that. And then there are some, again, individual versus market supply. This is exactly the same, just different data. You probably recognize some names here. Active members of the Cambridge Economics WeChat group. Same idea, right? For these are the supply schedules of 3 individual sellers. And if I, at any given price, if I add these quantities, I get the market supply curve. Okay, so these are my 3 individual supply curves. And if I add them, boom, I get the market supply curve. You can check the numbers. It should be working. So we see the concept of horizontal sum. Yeah. And that's it. So what do we have? Again, there are, so how many pages do we have for the summary? Where is the summary? I think there is a bit more. I think there are just 6 maybe. Yes, 6 pages to summarize because there are more diagrams. That's essentially it. Okay. More diagrams to summarize everything that the students must know about supply. List of definitions. How many definitions do we have about supply? I don't think there are so many, maybe one page. Yeah, a bit more. Yeah, almost just 1 page. All the definitions about supply. Concept cards. Let's see what drawing challenge we have. There are 2, the Statue of Liberty and Master Yoda. 2 drawing challenges. And is that it? And the student version of the PPT, only 33 slides. All right. But of course, I also give you the PDF. The PDF actually has 2 slides on each page, which means that if you print on both sides, in this case, it's only 9. Yes. Only 9 pages is going to be enough to print all that. All right. And I am done. Almost on time. Questions? Is this clear? This was not a very complicated workshop. Well, the content we covered tonight was not very complicated, and usually students do pretty well. They don't struggle too much with this. But if you have any questions, not necessarily about the content, but about the teaching strategies, about anything at all, feel free to type something in the chat box and I will give you some feedback. Nothing at all? Okay. All right. Let's just stop here for tonight. So next week, important workshop on elasticities. All of them actually, I think. Yes, maybe including the PES. I think so. So the PD, XED, YED, and PES. Not quite sure about the PES, but I hope we have time for it. It's going to be pretty busy. And for those attending the A2 workshops next week, is going to be about production in the short run and production in the long run. This week, the A2 workshop was fully booked. So make sure if you are interested, make sure you sign up in advance. Usually there are some seats left for AS. Of course, you will have access to the video recording later tonight. You will also have access to all the documents. You see, there were a few problems with the PPT. So if you wait, please wait until tomorrow before you download the documents, because I want to make a few modifications. I spotted a few issues in the PPTs tonight, so I will fix them tomorrow. So everything should be in order tomorrow by noon, so you can download the final versions. All right, have a nice evening, everyone, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.